wonderful here, and it's lovely to kick off the season of departmental seminars with Harald Baayen. Harald is a professor of quantitative linguistics at Tübingen. He has a background in linguistics. He was awarded a PhD in Amsterdam, where he stayed for his postdoc at MPI. He then became associate professor in Nijmegen, and he was full professor at University of Alberta in Canada. And in 2011, he was awarded Alexander von Humboldt Award. So he came back to Tübingen. And his work focuses on the interplay between morphology, phonology, orthography, and semantics. Harald has a long-standing interest in statistical techniques. He was a pioneer of the use of mixed effects models in linguistics and psychology. His theoretical and computational approach, Discriminative Lexicon, I think is very interesting for us in this department because it challenges localist assumptions on the way lexicon and semantics work. So I'm pretty sure you'll find Harald's talk food for thought.
Thank you. So it is a great pleasure to be here, and I would suggest that if you have questions as I go along, feel free to ask and interrupt. That can be a lot more fun if it's interactive. Okay, so I need to find somehow a place that I don't have a lamp in my eyes. So for my PhD thesis in the 80s, I was working on morphology and morphological productivity. And let me first, give you a bit of a very simple background on that. So, in linguistic morphology, people talk about word formation patterns. So you can have inflection like walk and walked. You can have derivation like good and goodness. And you have compounding like man and snowman. And morphological productivity is the starts with a very simple observation that word formation patterns differ with respect to the number of members attested in dictionaries and corpora. So if you look at words in English, then you have a lot of words that end in nus, but you don't have that many words that end in th that are derived from an adjective. What you also see is that over time, some patterns just get more and more attestations in use, and also over the lifetime, people will encounter some word formation patterns much more often than others. Now, this creates a problem for particular brands of theoretical linguistics. Yeah? So if you see morphology as an abstract symbolic system that defines an infinite number of possible words, why then is it that some rules are more productive than others, and that some rules can be totally unproductive? So, new words in th like long, length, strong, strength, warm, warmth, you don't encounter many of those new. There's a new one that I found, cool, that sounds very weird to native speakers, but in the context in what it was used, it was a kind of opposition to warmth, and there it worked. But why is it that some rules are more productive than others? And why is it that regularity does not imply productivity? That's the basic question. Am I making myself clear? If things are driven by regularity, then everything that's regular should be possible to be applied across the board everywhere. And it just doesn't work like that. So one of the early people at the MIT who really looked into morphology was Mark Aronoff. And this is one of the big questions that he also raised in his PhD thesis. Okay, now. these abstract systems that are based on symbol combinations, they can be quite useful. They can be very insightful if you try to understand how a language works. But how good are they? There are some problems that I just want to note. One is that there is no good definition of elementary units. So I list here die, der, and das, the three articles in German. Should we chop that into a de, an I, and de, an er, and de, and as? Or should we take this as all words? You can ask the same thing about le and la in French. And basically, I remember when I was even a student that you try, okay, let's see whether I can chop things into morphemes. It sounds like fun. And then very quickly you realize that you're facing all kinds of stupid arbitrary decisions. So I remember that what basically happened to me is that I gave up and pushed the problem out of my conscience. Yeah, that was basically what happened. And it's even worse. If you take languages with nice complex morphology, I know far less about Italian than I should know, but I will be talking a bit about Finnish. Finnish has inflectional classes. And are there 50 or are there 80? An older dictionary has 80 classes, a younger one has 50, so that means that the lumpers are now on top of the game and the splitters have lost. But I remember vividly a talk, maybe in Vienna at a morphology workshop or so, where there was somebody talking about Croatian, computational linguist, and telling me that there were 250 different inflectional classes in Croatian. And then at that moment, I think, how could that be? Why has it to be so terribly complex? And when we learn a language, even as children, are we little computer scientists figuring out that we need 250 classes rather than 240 or 200 or 180? So theoretical morphologists are forced to engage in handcrafting, as I see it. Typically using some simplicity metric to guide the process, and very often dismissing cognitive factors, or learning, experience, knowledge representation, and cultural factors like fashion, onomasiological needs, are all, described as extra linguistics. It's not linguistics. This is performance or whatever, but it doesn't have to deal with the task of the morphologist to tell you what the infinite number of possible words of the language are. Now, in the landscape of theories that are out there, so you have the theoretical morphologists, you have realizational morphology. So these people have moved away from the concept of the morpheme. The morpheme is a kind of Ling 101, or that concept that is the minimal unit combining form and meaning. And that sounds so cool. Yeah, and yet, if you look at what counts as morphemes, they have all kinds of weird properties, and all of those weird properties can be saved, by making all kinds of ancillary assumptions. But most people in theoretical morphology have moved away from the idea that the morpheme, that there are things that are the smallest minimal signs. They instead say that we have form bits that you can name stems and exponents. So exponent is then the term that replaces morpheme. And these are just bits of form. And then you have features, semantic features that you want to express. And then the task of the morphologist becomes how to describe the system such that if you have a bundle of features, you get the right kind of form. So then you have to describe how all those stems and exponents work together to give you the possible words. There's another stream called distributed morphology. That's basically much more from the generative school, where you merge morphology and syntax and do all kinds of things that I don't understand. But it's very much morpheme-based. And then you have cognitive linguists. They put experience and learning back on the agenda. So that's nice, but I have seen relatively little interest in formal or computational modeling in that community. And then you have psycholinguistics, and there, at least at the last conference on the mental lexicon in Montreal, I would say that 95% of the papers worked with obligatory decomposition of words into their constituent morphemes. Yeah, so there is again the minimal signs, and that's part of the game. And of course, opposite you have or had, you know, when the first mental lexicon conferences, so in the early 90s, I think, we had enormous debates between connectionist people like what's his name? His name's escaped me now, but you know, some of the big connectionist modelers were there, and there were fierce discussions between the Chomskyians and these. It was really interesting time. But it seems like this whole debate with connectionism has sizzled out. Everybody left the field and started doing something else. So that is a bit of the state as I see it there. So now, what we have been trying to do over the last 10 years or more, slowly creeping forward, because this is not something that you do in a very short time period. It's simply I've had to learn so much. But you can look at what we are doing as a kind of very simple connectionism with mappings between form embeddings and meaning embeddings. So simple connectionism, try to keep it much simpler than the connectionists did. I have a lot of respect for the connectionists given the hardware that they had and that there were no clear formalisms and ideas and worked out protocols of how you could set up deep learning networks. We are now so lucky that there's all these packages like PyTorch, and in multiple different languages you can do these things, and it is so easy. So I have a lot of respect for them, but I try to keep things easy and simple. And we'll see how far that works and where we do need deep learning. So the mappings that we can do. So first thing, if I talk about form embeddings and meaning embeddings, what do I mean with that? That's a metaphor. Yeah, what I mean is that I have numeric representations of words' forms, and I have numeric representations of words' meanings. Yeah, and if I look at Marco, he has been working with embeddings and has made this a kind of the center of the world of embeddings. So that's on the meaning side, but you can also try to create form representations of words in the form space. So you could take an audio signal of a word and vectorize it, and then you have a form embedding. Yeah? And what we now do is we say we have the form embeddings of words and we have the meaning embeddings of words, and now we see whether we can move from the form embeddings to the meaning embeddings or from the meaning embeddings to the form embeddings. And yeah, the form embeddings can be lots. They can be articulatory in nature. So a time series of control parameters for how you lower your jaw. They can be speech wave vectorized. They can be very simple. They can be a vector of ones and zeros which specifies which n-grams, let's say letter triplets, are present in a word. And the meaning embeddings, again, you have a lot of possibilities. They can be homegrown. You design them yourself on some basis of some principles, or they can be what I call static embeddings, so basically word-to-vec or fast text embeddings, give you one embedding for a particular word, or they can be contextualized embeddings, so the kind of embeddings you get for a particular word in its context if you use large language models. Now, when we try to model comprehension, going from some modality-specific input to meaning, or production, starting with meaning and trying to get out the right form, there are some linguistic goals and some cognitive goals. So the linguistic goals is that I want to have a working lexicon. Yeah? My colleagues in realizational morphology set up a whole system of ways in which you can, given a particular meaning, can arrange stems and exponents, and they try to describe in that way anything that's possible. Now, ideally, I would like to have a model that understands words and that produces words, and it does that correctly. Yeah, so that's a very simple goal, a working lexicon. And second goal is no hand grafting. Yeah, please, let's not try to decide whether we have to split articles into lower bits and pieces. And here comes the productivity into the game. We would also like to see whether the system will work for novel words. Now, this is one of the key issues in linguistics. So sometimes you see linguists walking with a little stylized bird on a t-shirt. The WUG task, this comes from 1958, this was a linguist, educational linguist, who was testing out whether little kids could come up with the plural for a novel object, like a WUG was a kind of new bird. So what's the plural of WUG? And then the kids had to come up with WUGs. And if you look in the original article, then some kids did it and others didn't. And it turns out that if you try to replicate this and you start out being critical, then you're going to have a tough time. It's by far not easy, and I know from people who worked, for instance, on Maltese, which has an incredibly crazy system. Even the adults don't know what to do, and the kids certainly don't know. But this study got into the generative literature like kids can always make a new form, a new plural of any word that they encounter. Okay. The cognitive goals are very simple and much more modest. It's trying to approximate what a mental lexicon of an individual language user could look like. And then let me explain this for a moment. If we take corpora, yeah, those corpora cover a community, a large group of speakers. And most of the people in the community know the high-frequency words. Most of the people in the community don't know the low-frequency words. Why? Because the low-frequency words are specialized words. So your doctor has a whole medical vocabulary, most of which you don't know. And then there are people who are specialized in old music, and they have their own vocabulary. And then there are the linguists, and then there are psychologists, and they all have their own vocabularies. And so what we get from a corpus is an overestimation of the low-frequency words that people are supposed to know. So that means that when we work with corpora, we shouldn't take those corpora as the norm when our idea is to try to get close to what individual speakers know. Now, another goal is that it should be learning-based. Yeah? So the model should learn. It's not that we can do some handcrafting and then transform everything into a finite state machine. We want a system that learns from experience. And that's the third point, sensitive to frequency of use as you go through life. Now, the model that I've been setting up, you have these form embeddings, these meaning embeddings, but a very critical property of the model is that these things are not stored. There's no exemplars. It's actually a lexicon without words. There's the network, but there are no words. So I think of a form embedding that you hear as something that hits your brain. Your brain does something, brings your brain in a high-dimensional state that we characterize with a meaning embedding, but that meaning embedding is also not stored as such. It is an experience of the moment, and then another word comes in, and you have another experience. And similarly, you conceptualize something, and then you produce a word, but nobody produces even a high-frequency word the same way twice. There is just so much variability in the semantics that we want to express, and there's, of course, motor noise. So storing all of these exemplars would, some people have argued for that, but I think it is just not necessary. It would require immense amounts of storage, and it would also require very smart, good algorithms to efficiently work with all those stored exemplars. So yeah, you need to start to do compression, and once you start doing that, why not just use a network? Now, what I'm going to talk about in the remainder of this presentation is 3 case studies that we are working on. One is productivity inflection, looking at Finnish case and number. Then I want to say a few words about productivity in derivation. And here I want to mention some results on the productivity of derivational morphology in the work of Thomas Mann, a very prolific German author who got a Nobel Prize for literature. And then say a few things about productivity in compounding, looking specifically at English and Mandarin. So, a few things about Finnish. Yeah, it's far from here, north, dark, cold, but they can speak. And they do that for nouns with 14 cases and 2 numbers, which means 28 inflected forms for every noun. Yeah? Now, then there is extensive stem allomorphy, affecting the stem final consonant. Finnish is a language where you have long and short vowels and long and short consonants that really are pronounced phonetically longer or shorter. And whether you pronounce it long or short, or whether you change it with respect to voicing, that is something that flips around between lemmas. In Finnish, many plural forms are built on the genitive singular, so that's also very weird. You take one form in the paradigm and then build a whole set of other forms from that form. And then, as I said, scholars disagree about the number of inflectional classes. You know, do you need 80 or only 40? Here you see, we're not going to work through all these paradigm members, but this is the first 2 words are from the same inflectional class, but what you can see already here, so you have this matto, and then in the genitive it is madon, and then you get here, for instance, maton in the elative, and then in the here you get madoisa, there's suddenly a D, but how and where, in which points in the paradigm these things appear differs, and even in one current inflectional class, there are still nouns that do it slightly differently. And if you're a splitter, you would say they're different inflectional classes. And if you're a lumper, you would say, no, this is the same. This is just too simple a difference to work out. Now these inflectional classes differ in productivity. I think that, what I know from Latin is that, the vocare class was very productive, lots of examples. And then with the nouns, you had where the verb, the third conjugation, I think, was all irregular. It's much smaller numbers of verbs, only 3 pages or so in my grammar. So what you typically find in these inflectional systems is that you have some classes that have a lot of types and typically very low frequency words in those classes. And then the unproductive, irregular classes are small and have high frequency words. Now here in this display, what you see is every dot is an inflectional class, and for every class here we are plotting median frequency vertically, the number of types, and you can see a negative correlation. So as I described, if you have a lot of types, your types are low frequency. Here, if you this is the probability of finding new types. That tends to increase with the type count. You see here a kind of quantitative description of how these inflectional classes work in this language. Now, if I go to this slide, so what we wanted to see is, can this very simple model that we have, can it learn this kind of complex system? without having to worry about inflectional classes, about all this consonant gradation. Will the model understand better those nouns that belong to the productive classes? And how well will it understand novel forms that the model has not seen before? Yeah? And here again, what is our prediction? What can we expect? So if you think about getting a novel form from one of those small, unproductive, irregular classes, that should be tough. Yeah? Because this is a form that you probably have to learn by heart. If you haven't encountered it before, you might not recognize it. Whereas if something comes from one of the big, productive, regular classes, that should be easy. Okay. So, implementation, we use 4 grams to specify, basically we have numeric vectors for a form that specify which 4 grams in the word are present. We use fast text embeddings on the meaning side. We use frequency-informed learning. So there are various ways in which we can train our networks. This is still a very simple way of doing things. It's basically just weighted multivariate multiple regression. So then we can bring in the frequencies with which words are used into the picture. We have 55,000 different forms of the 2,000 most frequent Finnish nouns. And then if we think about, the standard procedure in computer science is that you train a model on training data, and then you have held out data on which you look at how well it works. So what can we do? Well, because we use frequency-informed learning, we take frequencies into account, we are saying our held out data should be the low frequency words. Because those are the words that as a learner you are least likely to have encountered before. So we train on the 90% most frequent words and then test on something like 10% of the lowest frequency words. So here you can see accuracy on training and held out data. Type at 1 is the accuracy in terms of correct identifications of the types in a type list. So we have all the different word forms, and on the training data, the model gets 75, 76% correct. And if you say, is the correct word among the top 10, then you see that we had 98% correct on the training data. So that's pretty decent. If we have 50,000 different forms to choose between, then if you are correct among the top 10, then that's okay. Now, if you look at, there's one last column here, the token accuracy. So that corresponds actually to this one. So we're training with frequency. So the high frequency words are really rammed into this network. Yeah? And the low frequency words, any word that occurs once would not even be learned. Yeah? So our low frequency words are have not that low a frequency, but still you could say that if we evaluate not how many types did the model correct, but how many tokens did it get correct, then it is 96% of the tokens that are handled properly. So that would be pretty decent for everyday communication. Now, if you look at how does the model work with held out data, you can see 64%, or if you are among the top 10, 98%. So pretty okay. But not perfect. Held out data is difficult. Now, these graphs are very similar to the ones I just showed you before, but now what we have here is type frequency and here accuracy on the test data. And you can see that the more types there are, the better the model performs on the test data. Here, the more frequent the word is, the less well the model performs on held out data. Yeah, so here we are dealing with the irregular, small classes which you have to memorize by heart, and here the model really struggles. Yeah, but this is where learners also struggle. And here you see the more words that occur once only, then the accuracy goes up again. So these are, what the model is showing is the same kind of quantitative productivity characteristics that we see when we just study the whole classes with some quantitative methods. Now, the question now is, how can this stupid simple model work so well? Yeah. And one of the things that we think is going on is that there is substantial structure in inflectional classes. So inflectional classes are usually described as things you have to learn by heart. There's a wonderful text by Mark Twain about the awful German language where you have to memorize every case and every gender for every word, and there you can make, it doesn't make any semantic sense. Yeah, and that's the way that you know, in high school you learn about gender systems. And yet, as and we're not the first to observe this, various people in computational linguistics have been seeing this, that you can often predict inflectional class remarkably well from embeddings. So if I look at the inflectional classes in Finnish, then I can use just a simple linear discriminant analysis, a technique 100 years old, and it gets an accuracy of 48%. If you do leave one out, cross-validation, so try to be a bit careful, it's still 46%. And the majority baseline is 16%. So it means that there is these inflectional classes are not semantically empty. They have some semantic motivation. And you know, we were talking about this morning, but I think that it would be very interesting to look also into the Italian inflectional classes and conjugation classes and see what is going on there. And it is so simple to do. You take embeddings for a good sample and you see whether you can get the predictions out. So there is structure in the semantic space that corresponds to these weird ways in which the Finns inflect their nouns. And then if you look at the way that the system works, then interactions of case and number in the semantic space provide further structure for form learning, for the learning of form meaning mappings. So this is a graph that needs a little bit of explanation. What we do is we take for every dot here represents a case inflected form. But what it represents is the embedding of the plural minus the embedding of the singular. So what does that mean conceptually? You have your singular somewhere in semantic space. Here is your plural. So it's the vector that takes you from the singular to the plural. Yeah? So how do I get from my singular to the plural in semantic space? Now, then I still have long 300-dimensional vectors. So what I do is I use a clustering technique, T-distributed stochastic neighbor embedding, to just see whether there are clusters. And yes, there are clusters. They're very clear clusters. And those clusters turn out to be grouped by case. So that means that depending on the case, you move in a different direction to make a plural. Yeah? For the one case, you go in this direction. For the other case, you go in that direction. And I think that this has to do with the affordances. This is just, you know, we're trying to understand this, but probably different nouns have different affordances. I can put things on a table, normally not through a table. So this is going to be reflected. If you have oranges and pears and apples, they will appear in particular configurations in your supermarket or on your table in very different configurations than trains or trucks or other stuff. And actually, if you work with, this is just a little intermezzo, but if you do these shift vectors for English, then what you find is that you get clusters by semantic class. So in this graph over here, the colors hardly come through, but these are animals, these are plants. Here you have a whole set of group words. There are some artifacts in between that will come through that are then spelled out in more detail. You have musical instruments, toiletry, clothing, medicine, and this is done just by, okay, we see this TSNE plot, we take categories from WordNet, and then it turns out that you can start predicting what the semantic category is of an English noun, looking at the shift vectors from. So basically, how you, even in English, how you move from a singular to a plural varies by semantic class. And there are some languages, like Bantu languages, that actually bring this out in the morphology because they have inflectional classes, one for people, and then one for fruits, and one for animals, and so on and so on. Okay, back to Finnish. So the semantic clusters that you see here have to some extent parallels in the fusional endings of these case number combinations. So fusion, what I mean there is that we have one bit of form that somehow carries both number and case information. So it's not one bit that does number and one bit that does case. No, they're combined. And so, for instance, we have here him in matoin, and that really expresses relative plural. And in hindsight, it's just amazing how long it took us to realize this. If we can get this thing to move down, yeah. So here, just a tiny bit of formal representation. We have our form matrix, N words on the rows, and then K letter quadruplets on the columns. And then we have our mapping matrix, F, which has K n-grams on the rows, and then the semantic dimensions on the top. And then we have the S matrix, which has n words, and then its semantic dimensions on the columns. And then if you look at just the parts of those rows of the F matrix, then effectively what this is the semantic vector that this quadrogram contributes to the semantic vector of the whole word that the model predicts. Yeah. So that is, and now it turns out that if you look at, so here again we have this TSNE plot with the different case number combinations in Finnish. I've highlighted here two, the as if singular in red and the elative plural in blue. Now we take the centroid of those groups, just the average vector, yeah, and then we look at how well that average vector correlates with these row vectors in the F matrix. And then you see for in and hin, these are the two foregrounds that express the elative plural in here in Finnish. You get very high correlations for these two, and there are no others. So basically, what the model is doing is saying, I have this n-gram. This is a very good n-gram because it's only used for the elative plural. So it can be very correlated with the most typical prototypical meaning of the elative plural. And then it is not always that beautiful. So here you get the as if singular. The as if singular is realized by a whole range of different n-grams. But many of them are strongly correlated with the centroid of the as if singular. And then there are some that really suffer, that don't work very well. Here you have the nominative. The ranks are much higher, it works less well, but that's also not so surprising because the nominative is the most frequent, but also the most idiosyncratic in its exact form. You could almost say it doesn't have an ending of its own. Okay, so key points of this. You can model the comprehension of Finnish inflected nouns without handcrafting of stems, exponents, and inflectional classes. The simple error-driven learning is less productive, where human performance is also less productive. And most importantly, there are remarkable isomorphies between the form space and the meaning space. That is not something that I have to say over here. You knew that already. A few words, this is a short case study about productivity in production. So, we were looking at comprehension for Finnish. What about production? Now, first, a few general things about production. In acquisition, comprehension is way ahead of production. Our active vocabulary is much smaller than our receptive vocabulary. The words that we use is a subset of the words we understand. One of the things that Mark Aronoff pointed out to me once is that there's a whole set of words in English that nobody knows how to pronounce. They all know what they mean, but pronouncing them, you never know them. You only get them in writing. Why would you ever have to say them? It's part of the same phenomenon. And I already talked about the third point that individuals have much more limited vocabulary. So you can understand often a lot of what others are saying, even if you don't use it yourself. Now, okay, so now the question that arises is, how productive is morphology actually in the production of individual speakers? Yeah? So, should we take serious that there are infinite number of possible words, or maybe somewhat more limited number of useful words? How likely is it that a speaker coins a novel form that she or he has not heard before? And this question I will address by looking at derivational neologisms in the writings of Thomas Mann. And this is actually work that is mostly done by my friend and colleague Christian Berg at the University of Oldenburg. So here you see a picture of Thomas Mann. We are looking, so what Christian is doing is compiling a corpus of everything that Mann ever read. He had extensive diaries. We know his library is there, so we know exactly what he read. And for every word that he uses, we can determine whether he had probably heard it already earlier. Now, so far, it's only 25 years from 1889 to 1950. So, I'll skip this slide about data collection. This is the most important slide. So on the vertical axis, you have the cumulative number of types, and the yellow types are the types in the stuff that he likely has read, and the blue ones are the types that we know from his own output. So you can beautifully see that his own output in types lagged behind substantially what he actually read. And then you can see here the new types in his output. So these are words that Mann had not read before, had not used before, yeah, and that are really novel at that point in his career. Now, this axis goes from 0 to 10. Yeah? This axis runs from 0 to 700, 350. Now, this one is really not very productive. It's only got 12 here. Now, you see some of the words listed that he makes, but it is, I hope you see, it's not that much. Yeah? And this was for me an eye-opener, because I grew up in an environment where, and I used to believe when I was a grad student that we could all make this infinite number of words. And then here you have one of the most prolific, creative writers in German, and he hardly makes a derivation himself. And actually, if you look at some of the work that's being done in linguistics, where you trace what happens on the internet with novel words, you can typically see that there is some pop star or whatever who makes a new word, and that new word catches on, and then followers start using it, and then either it becomes really popular in the language or it sizzles out. Yeah? So it's not that everybody is this creative generative linguist making all those new words on the spot. No, it is the case that some popular figure makes a word, it gets adopted, and then it spreads along the ways that we know from sociology, social linguistics, social psychology, and you have adapters who take something, adopters, and take it and make it their own, or just leave it. So that's probably how most of the words that we get to know come into our vocabularies, because we just heard them before we started using them ourselves. Yeah? Well, but yes. You could do it. Yes, but part of the logic of the experiment, so to say, is that we have, or Christian has tried to do his utmost to trace anything that he could have read at that time. Yeah? So it is yes, but where would he get it from? It would, yeah, basically we're never sure. Yeah, it could be that these words are already existed in the community, but then I think that Christian and I would both say that first it would have to come from oral communication, because we've tried to do our utmost to cover everything. You know, Christian is making this corpus and compiling everything and so on. It's a lot of work, and he's done 25 years, and he's going to go on for another 50. It's work in progress, but we can see here already even the young man, Thomas Mann, yeah, he, you know, if to the extent that we can see and measure this and go back in time, because we know which newspapers he read, we know which journals he read, we know which books he read because they're in his library, and we know from his diary exactly what he was reading at what time. So we have a lot of information. That's what he's using. So that's all I can say. You know, there's no foolproof that we can. But you know, some of these words are really weird. Yeah. Yeah, well, that's not in here. And most of these words, I think, are words that he used once and then never again. So, key points of this, that even a highly prolific writer hardly ever produces novel-derived words, and the rate at which words are heard far exceeds the rate at which speakers produce these words themselves. So, also, when we do computational modeling for production, yeah, and we want to test on held out words, this is probably a very tough test that is cognitively maybe too harsh. Then, last case study, how can compounds be so productive? So compounds, you don't do that many of those in Italian, but you have a compensatory mechanism, namely nice short phrases that I only know French, so chemin de fer instead of railroad, but you must do something very similar. Yeah, but in Germanic languages, but also Finnish, Estonia, Mandarin Chinese, Vietnamese, compounding is extremely productive. It's basically what you do most of your stuff with. But in good old structuralist linguistics, compounds were not considered to constitute a morphological category, because there's no systematic proportional analogy between form and meaning. So I tend to look at compounds more like morphological bricolage. I don't know whether you know that term. It comes from the anthropologist Levi-Strauss, who was saying that if you look at the religions and the rituals of across the world, what you often see is that you pick pieces from here and there and give them new uses. So the bricoleur is the handyman, the tinkerer. You use bits and pieces for new purposes. So you like to make a new chest, and you use wood from here and wood from there, and every side and piece has its own history, but they together have a new function. And something like that is going on a lot with compounding. You grab one word, another word, you put them together to new purposes, and then you don't have to learn all kinds of new sequences. You just use all these bits, and but then how? How do we then understand these compounds? And here, there are, of course, several possible answers. So people have argued for semantic relations. So an anthill is a hill made by ants. But defining those semantic relations is terrible. No, I've tried it myself, and you go crazy. I once had a student assistant who quit the job because she said, I cannot do this consistently. And there is a paper by Schmidtke, Gagné, Kupperman, and Spalding that actually shows that it is just miserable. They don't mention that because Gagné has been believing in these semantic relations for her whole career. But if you look at, hardly anybody converges on the same interpretation. 5 different interpretations. There's also work by Melanie Bell and her colleagues in this direction. So my hypothesis with compounding is that semantic relations can play a good role when you try to think through why this word means what it means. I remember as I was still a young kid walking along the beach in the Netherlands and then thinking, why is the word for surf, so the rolling and splashing of the waves, branding in Dutch, which means burning. Yeah? Well, etymologically, it might go to some kind of Proto-Indo-European verb meaning irregular motion. You'd never know whether that is the fantasy of the dictionary maker or whether it is really true. But you have these words where you just wonder, why do they mean what they mean? And that is, I think, where the semantic relations are useful. Now, there is some stuff that's covered by something. Let me say a few words about Marco's chaos model, but also deep nets that we have been using. So here the task is predict the meaning of the compound from the meaning of the constituents. So for some 90,000 German compounds, the accuracy for held out data is 21%. If you throw a deep network at it, I can crank it up to 51%. But that's still, 1 in 2 words are incomprehensible. Yeah. Mandarin compounds, if you take 2-character compounds, we get 1% correct for chaos, 50% for the deep net. These are miserable words that I love them, but they are just not very predictable. And if you look at 4-character compounds, which consist of 2 pairs of 2-character words, then it already gets a lot better. So chaos gets 26%, and I think something like 49% with deep mapping. Say if I have something like dansche, but that has something like dan and sh is, and what that dan does, who knows? Yeah. But if I have a 4-letter compound like tianhua, Halma, so telephone number, tianhua is telephone, Halma is number, then it suddenly starts to look like a nice interpretable compound. So the productivity sits in the longer compounds in Mandarin Chinese. Now, if you look at the DLM, now the task is predict the meaning of the compound from its written form. I have here some 11,000 English words, and you can see that accuracy on testing data over here is absolutely miserable. Yeah, 12% here, 0% for frequency-informed learning. So here we kick the frequencies out, and you can just, pretend that there are no very frequent words that absorb a lot of your experience. And even accuracy at 10 is only 11%. So DLM cannot do it either. If anything, that's on chaos. So, yes?
Sorry, just one question, because I think that what counts
So basically, I have my held out word. I predict a semantic vector for that word. Now I look around. I look at the neighbors. I look at what is my closest neighbor. And then I look, is that closest neighbor of my prediction the correct word that I was trying to learn? If so, then it is accurately recognized. If not, then I got it wrong.
What if you have many words with the same meaning, synonyms?
Yes, then it becomes fun. Yeah, and then you have to think about what it is. So, for instance, in paradigms, you have syncretic forms. So, something can be a nominative singular, or it can be a genitive plural, or something like that. So, we can either be strict and say, no, this was the token that in my list had nominative and plural, you got it wrong. Or you can say, no, it's good as long as you got any one of the possible forms correct. And that's your choice. So in our software, we have enabled you to do this in different ways, depending on what you think is the most honest way to do it. Does that answer your question? Good. So, I think that we shouldn't be too optimistic about how well novel compounds can be understood. I can tell you all kinds of anecdotes. I don't have the time. So let's consider for a moment how known compounds are processed. Now, you can think, what do? We can obligatory chop up a compound like airplane into air and plane. Yeah? Meaning something like aircraft. If you think about what that means. Now, in my lexicon, I have air and I have plane. So there's air, the stuff that I move my hands around in, and then we have plane, which is a flat surface. How on earth do I get to the meaning of airplane on the basis of those two things? Yeah? Maybe hash coding. But the DLM, our model, doesn't do this kind of decomposition. So can it then do anything useful for these compounds? And one of the things that that we find is that the engrams that are on the boundary between the words, so air and craft. So here the word is airfield. If you take IRF, this is a trigram that doesn't occur in air and it doesn't occur in field. It sits on the boundary. And in the model, you see that those trigrams are the key to the meaning of the compound. So a lot of people have said, when you have low transition boundaries, that's the place where you split. But in this model, it says, these are the only trigrams that tell me something useful about the meaning of the compound, because for all the other trigrams that already occur in the constituents, those are much more tied to the constituents because the constituents are much more frequent than the compound as a whole. So that's how these things pop out as the most important. And here, this is a graph that shows for different groups the proportion of trigrams in a word where you have that the boundary trigram is more correlated with the word meaning than its left constituent. That's almost all. Here, the boundary trigram is more correlated with trigrams in its right constituent. It's almost all. And if you look here at the left trigram is how well that is correlated with the compound meaning, then you can see that those correlations go down a lot. So, for this model of ours, it is the stuff at the boundary that is the most important. So, my time is running out. Few models. So, if it is indeed true, this is a model, so the model is wrong. Yeah, that's not pretend it is correct. It is an approximation and a simplification of what we know. But if the trigrams that straddle a constituent boundary in compounds are important, then it is absolutely clear why the model cannot handle novel compounds, because it doesn't have the trigrams experience that will help it to guess what the meaning of the compound should be. And the last point here is basically saying, okay, we have the subliminal processing, which is what my model aims at. And that helps, that is useful for predicting things like RTs, which are really under time pressure, so you cannot think too much about it. Whereas I think that chaos is really, really good for if you have semantic relatedness ratings for the meaning of something and the whole. And now, a few words, if I may. I've been talking for an hour. You might be getting sick of it. So I can wind up and skip some stuff about Mandarin, or if you can bear with me a little bit longer, it's up to you. Is that okay? Shall I ramble on a bit? Okay. So for English, we have these nice trigrams. But if you go to Mandarin, Mandarin is a language which has only roughly 400 syllables, if you look at the segments. And if you add tones, Mandarin is a tone language, so your pitch discriminates between words, then you have 2,000 syllables. That's a lot less than you have in English. So that means that these boundary trigrams cannot do that much good work in Mandarin. Now, it turns out that the phonetic realization of Mandarin tones provides a beautiful compensatory mechanism. And this, again, we need embeddings to do this. So standard theory of Mandarin tones, a syllable can have 5 tones. 2-syllable compounds, 2-syllable words inherit the tones of their single character constituents. And then these tones are subject to all kinds of factors that change them. Speech rate. Yeah. If you talk faster, you cannot have big tone excursions. Assimilation with adjacent tones, segmental properties, predictability and context, utterance position, and so on and so on. Now, to look at spoken Mandarin, this is spoken Mandarin spoken in Taipei, Taiwan, but we also are now working on spoken Mandarin spoken in Beijing, spontaneous conversations. And you see here a kind of decomposition with generalized additive model of the pitch contour of a word into component pitch contours. So, for instance, here you see the pitch contour for males and the effect of females on the pitch contour. And then here you see with different lines the effect of low versus high bigram probabilities, and so on and so on. Here you see the effect of assimilation. I don't want to go into the details of this. The beauty of a GAN is you've probably all heard about Fourier transforms. Yeah, so then you decompose a wave into a whole set of sines and cosines. Here we decompose a wiggly curve into simpler constituent curves that you have to all add up to get the curve of the word. Yeah? And the fun of it is that you can link those individual curves to linguistically interpretable predictors. That makes it fun. And now, what we have been seeing is that words, Mandarin words, have their own pitch signatures. So you see here, these are all words that should have the rise fall tone, so it should be something like xi guan for habit in the upper left. But what people say is xi guan. And if you go to yi dang, like that, but then I also have here, let's say this is something like nian qi. Yeah? I'm overdoing it, but I'm trying to give you a sense of what these, it looks like words have their own pitch signatures. Yeah, and now comes the real fun, namely that we want to model how can we predict these pitch signatures. Yeah? And for that, we take contextualized embeddings. Yeah, so you see here, every dot is one of the tokens of the words in this particular data set. And we have here just a TSNE plot of these different words, and every dot is just one token. And you see that you get eating here. Most of them form a nice cluster, which is exactly what you want if you have contextualized embeddings. You don't want those to be scattered all over the place. So for the words, we now have contextualized embeddings, and we also have pitch contours. Now what we do is we put these pitch contours in normalized time so that they're all equally long. Now we have a form matrix with all the word tokens with their pitch contours, 50-dimensional, and then we have 600-something dimensional GPT-2 contextualized embeddings for all those words. And now we want to see whether we can map between these two. So can we predict from the pitch contour which word it is? And if we know the meaning of the word token, can we predict its pitch contour? Are you with me? What the question is? Yeah? And here you get prediction accuracy for comprehension. There are two ways in which we made the normalized time pitch contours. Let's just focus the one that is labeled word, but it doesn't really matter. You could see that we get something like 33% correct with a linear mapping. And if we make a nonlinear mapping with a residual network, then we are at 60% on the training data. And if you go to the held out data, so novel tokens of words the model has seen before, but these are novel tokens, then we are 30% roughly, and here 50%. That's pretty stunning. You know, we were excited to find this. That means that there's, even though word recognition in Mandarin, of course, also benefits from the segments, you can already get very, very far from the tone information. And if we then go to production, so now we go from the contextualized embeddings and predict pitch contours, and then you can see it really doesn't matter anymore whether we use, this is training, this is test, let's just look here, this is a deep network, this is a linear mapping. Linear mapping is already perfectly fine. This probably also has to do with the fact that here we are going from a high dimension to a lower dimension, whereas for the comprehension it was the other way around. And what is, and, you know, we can replicate this at all kinds of complication levels, but what you see here is basically an average curve, the curve isolated by the GAM in blue, and the curve predicted by our mapping from the semantics. And what you do is you take all the tokens of Ronyi, then you take the mean of that, so the centroid, and then you pipe that through your mapping, and then you get the word curve back that the GAM observed. So, now I will, key points, actually, time runs out. I just want to show, these are English curves, similar kind of plot. Seems to work for English left-stressed two-syllable words as well. And here we're looking at homophones. So these are words like wait and wait that are supposed to sound the same. We know already, I have a paper with Susanne Gall in language last year where we use embeddings to predict acoustic duration. But here we have a time-normalized spectrogram for weight and weight. This is the difference surface that we get out of the GAM. And this is just looking at what a forced aligner does. And if you are weight, the blue curve, then it is clear that you have to wait longer before you start hearing the vowel. Yeah? So there's segmental differences in the realization of these homophones. And you can also see, for instance, here, that if you are fine weight, then there's a lot more activation in the spectrogram than if you are the heavy weight. So that brings me to the really, well, you can use LDL to do mappings between them, works fine. Concluding remarks. So in the lexicon, form, also phonetic form, and meaning spaces are to a considerable extent isomorphic. And they can be approximated well from each other with simple linear mapping. That's, I think that these isomorphies enable very effective statistical learning. I don't think that you will be able to detect this kind of pattern with some kind of identification task because there is a lot of variability here. But people pick it up. You know, we're just describing what people do, so they must have learned this somehow. And then a final consideration is we've seen, especially for the production, which is the most natural thing, that the linear mappings work so well. Why do they work so well? And I asked this question to a group of computer scientists, and my host and friend Sebastian Otter said, well, maybe this makes sense. If you think about linear mappings, they are very, very easy. They don't cost much energy. Yeah? So if you have a subliminal system that is really automatized, if you only have to map between things that are perfectly aligned with a linear mapping, then you can be really, really fast without much energy demands. It's when things get unexpected, then higher level cognition needs to kick in, and then you may need nonlinear mappings in order to deal with the stuff that is not that well predicted. So that's basically where I will stop because I can go on for ages, and I should thank you for your patience. Yeah.
Especially for the diacritic words. Because, yes, as we know, that compounding is kind of the most productive mechanism in Chinese lexicon, and approximately accounting for 80% of the words in our lexicon. And diacritic maybe to over 60% of the words in our lexicon. And for your work, you mentioned that chaos model of very well bad performance in recognizing the diacritic words, like over just 1% accuracy rate. I guess you use the fastest pass.
No, it was Tencent embeddings. Tencent embeddings.
Yes.
I think.
Yes.
I have to look it up. I must confess.
Yes, when you mentioned that you predict using the constituents to the compound meaning, I think you have to assess to the constituents. Like,
so basically, it's just you take the embeddings of the constituents, you try to predict the embedding of the compact word, and then you,
Yes, potential model is kind of off-the-shelf embedding for the existing words. And if you want to get the constituent embedding, maybe you use the faster test to distribute to attract the embeddings for a fragment of this diacritic words. Like,
no, I think for the monosyllabic words you have independent vectors, right?
Just for diacritic, if you want to access to the constituent, you must use the faster test to.
No. If I go to Tencent embeddings, I can get an embedding for sure.
Yes, you can. Yes, that's because it's in vocabulary.
Yes, and then I can get if.
I saw you have over 20,000 words for diacritic words, and you guess the compound meaning using chaos framework, like inferring the compound meaning from the constituents.
Yeah.
What I want to say is that some models, so two things matters. One is about the underlying embedding quality, and the second is about the chaos framework proposed by Marvel. And I would like to say the quality of the embedding models actually matters because we have a very similar study recently, and we saw that if you remove those out of vocabulary words, the model performances like chaos, they improved a lot.
Yeah.
If we include that already words, words. And this is because when you restrict the constituent representation using fast text, I think that's the only way we get the sub-word embeddings, right? Because fast text model train the embeddings using the default 3 to 6 n-grams. However, for Chinese, most of the words are lesson, which means that the model didn't have a good training on the one character embedding.
It's a good point. I will check again what exactly we did, but I'm pretty sure we were not using FastTech but Tencent. Because Tencent embeddings are better.
Yes, yes, yes. Yes, maybe we can check it later. Okay.
We can be in touch.
Yeah. If I'm allowed, can I have one more question about the differences in terms of the form embeddings and meaning embeddings? Because we are trying to say that a linguistic form is a pair of word meaning forms. To me, like the meaning embeddings and form meaning embeddings, they are just the two sides of the same coin. And when you mention the form embedding, are you mention the abstract construct, morphological construct or something? Like you mentioned the flora S. Did you say the form representation is for this abstract construct of plurality?
What for me a form representation is anything. You can derive it from the orthography, or you can derive it from the sound, or you can derive it from parameters that guide the vocal track model, anything that has to relate with how we speak or what we hear.
So then you use the semantics of this extension under this construct to differentiate them to classical semantics.
Yeah. So basically, the big question is, what is a word? Yeah. And for Chinese, that is already not an easy question. But the best that I can think of right now is that a word is a cluster of tokens and a cluster of corresponding semantic embeddings that people feel are roughly the same, that correspond to each other.
It's about mostly your first case study.
Yeah. You want me to page back?
Probably it's not needed. It's technical, but maybe also theoretical. So if you are using fast text,
Yeah.
you already have information about some form of representation. I would say you have a point in the semantic space that is also related to n-grams. In principle, you can train a fast text model with your 4 grams that you have used in your form vector. And most of the things that you've done can be done without linear mapping at that point. Because you can just take the vectors of the 4 grams and sum them up and have a representation of out of vocabulary items, of in vocabulary items excluding the whole word. So probably my question is, 2 questions are. The first is more technical. How do the model like that perform in comparison to the one where you have the added complexity of the mapping? And the second question is, can you even push the whole thing more and even avoiding at a certain point the distinction between form and meaning?
Yeah. So with respect to the first question, I think that what we used were fast text vectors with minimally 5 grams as subunits. So that is on the technical side. It's not like we're redoing fast text. Adding to that, if you think about what fast text is doing, it's nice engineering. But I've never thought of it as a cognitively very plausible way of thinking about how recognition works. Now, if I work with 4 grams and it's just the orthography, fine. But if I just work with the audio signal, and we have one implemented model that works with the audio, and then I can use fast text embeddings as my best guess at what the meaning might be. But then there is no trigrams in there. It's really, if you think about auditory word recognition, you move very far away from your question. And if you would do vision with these you have vision technology, these convolutional networks, then you would also not have the same. So, and as to how different are form and meaning, I think my answer would be that the speech signal that I hear, that is the input, that would be the form in one case, is not the same as the semantic percept, which is a state of high-dimensional state of my brain after having experienced that. But it's a great question because I've been worried about this, and this is my answer. So if it's not a good answer, then please tell me. Then I'll try to keep thinking.
No, but this just means that to develop this model like puzzles can suggest you that, and I think it's in line with what you said, that meaning might just be a distribution of forms without necessarily having this assumption of two very well separated things.
Well, I agree that meaning is this kind of highly distributed, very context-driven knowledge that we build up as we try to navigate the world. And the embeddings are a wonderful way of getting at that. But my task as a linguist is that I have this, which is we give that some kind of characterization in a high-dimensional space. But that is not the same as my audio signal. And my audio signal is not the same as the kind of vision model would get as a signal. And I take my vectorized spectrograms. Yeah, I can use that as a goal for production. Or I could use that as a goal for input, for comprehension. Those things are not in the same space as the semantic understanding. So I think that the danger is greatest if you only look at writing. But the moment that you step away from writing and you look at all other modalities, also speech generation, if you go from the semantics and you have to move this up and down, yeah, then you have dealing with very different kind of output and input systems. Great questions.
I have a last. I don't know if there's anyone else. Okay, I have one last one.
Yeah.
Probably goes a little bit far from your talk, but you touched base very quickly. So the model is basically a connection between form and meaning, which kind of deviates from like localist approaches, which in turn work surprisingly well in neuropsychology. So it's like, there is a reservoir for words, and it's there. Or it looks to be there, at least. Yes. Like neuropsychology and neuroimaging have done a fairly decent work in figuring out where the lexicon could be. Do you think that what we've been looking at so far is just not like a reservoir of words, but actually of small bridges between their form and their meaning? So actually, what we've been seeing so far in brain research is just a place in which all these small bridges are. So what do you think the implications of your model could be for brain research, if any?
It's a great question, and I, of course, don't have a good answer. So I will try to, improvise. There are two things. First of all, we are not thinking about the localization of embeddings. So I once tried a little bit to see whether but that was a small data set, and for small data sets it works, and for bigger it doesn't. But what if we would try to project all our embeddings onto a towel, and then we can wriggle it up and pretend that it's the cortex. Yeah. So can we get some kind of spatial? So take a TSNE mapping of our whole space. You would get some areas of vocabulary that show up, and that might be what can be picked up with neuroimaging methods. Yeah. I don't think, because we also know I'm not particularly a fan of trying to localize all kinds of things in the brain, although we had this history of phrenology, so but it's coming back in a more sophisticated way, maybe. But we have different areas. There's a primary auditory cortex. There's the first vision system, V1 out back there. So there are areas where things go first. Yeah, and a lot of what I have been doing, if I talk about form and meaning, I'm trying to approximate what ends up here or what ends up here and there. Yeah, and how do you get from there to the temporal lobe and this and that, and to your knowledge of the motor systems and so on and so on. So, and just to give one example, if I have a colleague who has been working on phonology, but then in the brain. So you have these ECOG experiments, so you cut away the bone here, and you put electrodes right on the brain because these people are going to undergo surgery for epilepsy. And you don't find any evidence for phonemes, for regions that correspond to phonemes. You find areas that are responsive to more higher order things that don't correspond to anything that look like our traditional linguistic things. So I think that something like with words, it's so easy to say that a word means something. And then I say, wait, and then you think, oh yes, this guy is overweight. And then, and you don't think of the other way. And if you go to Mandarin Chinese, every syllable has so many possible different meanings. And yet we talk about words as if they exist, as if they have one meaning, as if you can say, this is the word. And I think that is just the original sin of a lot of neuroscience, that they take these words that are very simplified concepts that come out of very bad linguistics, yeah, and then treat it as gods. And then you try to find God in the brain. But now at this moment I become an atheist and say that we don't even know how to very well define a word. And then you think about, okay, there's the written word. But, one of the examples I can give for English is a very frequent pronunciation of the word for yesterday is yeshay. Yeah? And if I give yeshay to you in isolation, you wouldn't recognize it. And if I say probably, that's one that's now reaching awareness. Yeah? For probably. But, the word, the Dutch word eigenlijk can reduce to echt. Yeah? And in context, it's perfectly fine. You understand that, but you have no meta-linguistic awareness of it. So there is an enormous variability in what words mean. I really believe in contextualized embeddings. And there is an enormous variety in how we pronounce those words. Yeah? And that variety is, so I think if I can say anything here, the variety in auditory realization of words is immense. It's as immense as what you have in the contextualized embeddings. And what I've been trying to say is that we can link those two. But then we have to, and the orthography is our abstract cultural convention of managing this variability. It tames the variability on the phonetic side and the variability on the semantic side. Yeah? But we shouldn't take this word as the mediator. That's my answer. I finally got out of the rabbit hole.